and welcome to Keep the Channel Open. My name is Mike Sakasagawa, and this is episode 34. This week's guest is poet Hanif Abdurraqib, and we'll get to that real quick. First thing, I just got back this evening from attending a meeting of my local school board, and so that's on my mind right now. Here in San Diego, the school district that we're a part of is facing these really huge budget cuts for next year, and so I and hundreds of other people came out to the board meeting this evening to give our thoughts and to try and convince the board to change its mind on how it was going to deal with that. I ended up waiting 2 hours to give 1 minute of testimony, and then it was another 45 minutes or so after me before everyone else was done giving their 1 minute speeches. And people were really fired up. They were passionate. Some people were in tears. Others were angry. Some people brought charts. Some told these highly personal stories about their experiences or about their kids' experiences. There were teachers and school nurses and custodians, occupational therapists, school counselors, and obviously a whole bunch of parents. And at the end of it all, even though the board didn't end up voting the way that we all wanted them to, I thought to myself, wow, this is a big deal, the way people are showing up and speaking out and making sure that our representatives know we're paying attention to what they're doing. And they did know. I watched one of the board members give his statement after sitting through over 2 hours of public testimony, and he couldn't even look up when he spoke. He was clearly feeling very guilty about the whole thing, which, I'm not necessarily here to make people feel bad, but my point is just this, that all over the place, I see people who are motivated and who are dealing with really shitty situations, but who are not letting that stop them from getting to work on these issues that affect their lives. And that's something that I'm finding really helpful, to be able to see that energy. Anyway, back to today's show. As I mentioned, for today's show, I'm talking with Hanif Abdurraqib, a poet whose work I really admire. His book, The Crown Ain't Worth Much, came out last year, and it was just incredible. I really enjoyed it, and I was really pleased to get to talk to him about it. In addition to being a poet, Hanif also writes about music and culture for MTV News, and in November, he'll have a collection of essays out from $2 Radio entitled They Can't Kill Us Until They Kill Us. All right, let's jump in, shall we? Here's my conversation with Hanif Abdurraqib. So how are you? How you doing?
I'm good. I'm a little exhausted. I've been traveling a lot, and I have this small window where I'm not traveling a whole lot, so I'm trying to catch up on writing and sleeping and eating normally, and living a somewhat regular schedule.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What's keeping you so busy?
So it's like a combination of things. I haven't done a proper tour for my book because I just don't want to be away from home that much, because I like my bed and I like the market next to my house, and I like playing video games every now and then. But what that means is I oftentimes just do large blocks of things or large runs of things. I'll go to a part of the country and just kind of do a week of readings or something like that. Though this month I was back home in Columbus for a week. So I had a reading in Akron, Ohio, and I thought I would just, hang out in Columbus for a bit. I've had a couple of readings in New York, which I'm close to, close enough to take a train or a short car ride to, but, that's kind of been a lot. And yeah, it's a lot of back and forth a lot of back and forth travel, which I don't mind traveling, but, it has been pretty massive at times.
Yeah, it can wear you out.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, so your book, which for the listeners is entitled "The Crown Ain't Worth Much," I gotta say, I really just love the hell out of this book.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah,
I appreciate your consistent support of it. That's really cool.
Yeah. I think I pre-ordered it, so I think I got it right right when it first came out. But yeah, it was reading this book was a real intense experience for me. It was I don't know. I guess poetry can be that way, but I really just I don't know. I found a lot to connect with in it.
Oh, that's great. That's great.
Yeah. So, like, I was wondering if you wouldn't mind if just talk a little bit about the book and how it came about.
Yeah, The Crown Ain't Worth Much is such an interesting thing because I think, people kind of see it now, this like massive finished product.
Mm-hmm.
But it began as like 12 or 13 poems that were loosely scattered in a lot of I think of those 12 poems that began with, 6 of them are not in the book. They're just Button Poetry, which is the press that put out the book. Very thankful for them. They do incredible work. They had a chapbook competition, which is like chapbook's like a smaller poetry book, like, 15 to 20 poems. And one of their editors solicited me and was like, hey, we'd like it if you'd send over work to our chapbook competition. And I was like, well, all I have are these like 13, 14 poems. And they're kind of like loose and not really in an order. And so I sent that. And when it came time to announce the finalists, they were like, hey, you didn't win, but you're a finalist. And I said, well, that's cool. You know what I mean? Like I wasn't, I kind of didn't think I just kind of submitted the book to the competition because I was asked to, I wasn't really expecting to win. So when I was named a finalist, I was like, wow, this is a real huge deal. And they're like, and we liked your poems enough that we thought, the final judge liked the poems and they liked the poems. And they were kind of like, do you have more poems like this? Are these reaching towards a larger story? And can you, do you think you could turn this into a full manuscript? And I was a little surprised by that. It felt like I lost the competition, but also kind of won another thing. I still won a book, like a full length book deal, which is hard for poets, And so it was this weird thing where it was like, well, you lost this chapbook competition, but you won this like coveted full length book deal. And it was going to be their first full length book. They'd only done chapbooks to that point. Now they have others, and they have others forthcoming that I'm really excited about. But it was kind of this leap of faith. With them, I had another press that was somewhat interested in my poems, but I really believed in Button's vision, and they were kind of like, we'll let you create the book you want. We're going to give you the tools to make this the best debut book that you could possibly have, and the one that that we'll really be proud of. And so I got to this process of kind of filling out the book as I wanted it to as it was coming up together in my head, Mm-hmm. And I think I did all right. I mean, I think like the book really, the vision that I had for it is what it is. And I don't know if everyone can say that about something that they've marinated and had in their heads for 2 or 3 years.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it's a really impressive collection, and when you not knowing sort of the genesis of it, if you come to it, just find it on the shelf or whatever, it really feels like a very cohesive whole, like with like an overarching narrative and arc to it. Like it really feels all of a piece.
Right. That was my hope. I'm glad to hear that.
Yeah, no, and it was really, I don't have like a ton of experience with poetry. I sort of dabble with poetry, but I find that and I don't know if maybe this is just like a newer thing, that when I started reading poetry, like in high school, it was just it was a different world back then. But a lot of the poetry collections that I've read have not really felt, they really feel more like a collection rather than like one solid whole thing, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I don't know if that's like, I've read a couple like chapbooks that have that feeling to them, that are sort of all, like like a concept album rather than like a best of kind of thing. But with full length collections, I haven't read that many that felt that way to me.
Yeah. And I think it's hard to stretch that out. It's hard to stretch out a concept that can live for as long. And I think The Crown Ain't Worth Much is not a short book. You know, it's a long book of poems. And I wanted to. That was intentional. I didn't want it to feel long. You know, I didn't want it to feel tedious. But I wanted it to go through four very distinct and important movements that all tie together, you know? And in order to do that, it had to be, you know, kind of a massive undertaking.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it is long. There are a lot of poems in the book, but it never feels, like it drags, to me anyway. And I think, I mean, part of it too is that like a lot of the poems are sort of emotionally intense. Yeah. So I think it took me a couple weeks to read the whole thing, just because like I couldn't sit and read like for 2 hours, because it was like sometimes it got to be like I had to kind of sit with some of the poems a little bit, you know?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I get people who are either like, I read this in one weekend, or people who are like, I talked to someone, I did a show in Kansas City last week, and I talked to someone who was like, I've had your book for like 6 months and I still haven't finished it, because it's just so, you know, like it is intense to get through. Which is, you know, and I don't know if I didn't think about that. I didn't think about it in that way where, you know, and a lot of it is because of the way the book is speaking directly to either moments I've witnessed or lived or have thought about. So I was living inside of the work in a way that didn't allow me to maybe get a full grasp of its intensity. And I also tried to like lighten that. I think I'm like losing my ability to like figure out what is an emotionally intense thing. I think I've lost my gauge entirely, because in my head, I was like, the third section of the book, a lot of those poems are about my anxieties about marriage. I was newly married at the time of writing the book. And I thought that section would add some levity to the intensity of the first two sections, and before the fourth section, which is the most intense in the book. The fourth section, the fourth section is largely the title poem, the Crown Ain't Worth Much, the poem itself. The fourth section I wrote mostly, the book was only 3 sections, and then the Baltimore uprising happened, and I wrote all the poems in the fourth section while staying up at night and watching that. And so within that third section, I was like, man, you know, these poems are light. You know, a lot of them are maybe a little sad, but mostly like kind of funny about, you know, how weird it is that I'm married. And then people are like, no, the third section is the one that makes me the saddest. Because I really missed the mark there.
I mean, I don't know if I think that those poems are sad exactly. I don't know if I think that in general I would characterize these poems, the whole book, as sad exactly, you know?
Right.
Like some of them are very sad, but like on the whole, even though some of them are very intense and some of them do have a sad quality to them, it like there's something about the whole thing that, like to me, when I'm reading through them, you have this progression from, you know, sort of through time as you move through the book, where, you know, and especially because you've tagged many of them with like years or dates.
Right. Yeah.
And so you can feel this progression from yourself as a younger man, like, you know, a teenager, I guess, and then moving up into, you know, approaching the present day. And there's something about that has, like you said just now, that, you know, you were living these experiences as you were writing them, and they're very clearly, all of this is very personal.
Right. Yeah.
But some of the poems, they kind of slide back and forth between experience and memory, where like some of them feel very immediate, but especially as you move towards the later poems, even though they're recalling earlier events, have this sort of weight of like, you know, your adult self remembering these things, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. So there's a heaviness to them, but it's not exactly sadness, you know? I think. Anyway.
That's what I always hope to hear about the poems. I think that's perfect. Yeah, you know, I think like I think sometimes when we talk about sadness, at least for me, it sometimes feels like a well, I don't know. This sounds like I'm being mean to people who engage with my poems and feel like they're sad. I don't mean to do that. But I think I am interested in the emotion that's resting underneath sadness. Sadness feels like the broad emotion, right? The like, it's the hit song. Sadness is the hit song, and I'm looking for like the emotions that are the deep album cuts. And I think that, when people say, well, your poems are just sad, I am interested in what is moving underneath that sadness for them. And if hopefully there's a joy underneath it too, or there's a kind of small moment that is pulling them towards another thing. And so I'm not saying that anyone who says that my poems are sad, I don't think people are like lazy or not reading them well. But I am personally, as the writer, looking to enter the room of sadness and look around and find what else is in there.
Mm-hmm. It's tough too because as a person who's making the art, you're going to have a certain relationship with the art that is going to be very different from what the reader brings to it, because everybody's going to be bringing their whole life to every piece of art that they take in. So I don't know. It's kind of tough to navigate that sometimes.
It is, yeah. Understanding that my experiences are not the universal experience, you know what I mean? Even as someone who tries to write into my experiences to offer people a window, I still have to pull myself back and understand that there is not one universal experience. And even as much as I lean into this wide berth of nostalgia, right? This wide range of nostalgia that I try to reach into, I have to understand that, that's not going to pull everyone in the same direction.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I know, for me, nostalgia can be a pretty powerful experience, and oftentimes is tinged with a certain sadness. But, I guess that's even what the word means, right? The pain of return.
Yep.
But I don't know. There's something about especially the early poems. I was thinking about this as I was reading it, and then again as I was sort of thinking again about the poems. As I was preparing to talk to you, that the early poems, the first, especially in the first section, have this really youthful feeling. They feel very young, and there's something about that because even though many of the experiences that you're recounting in these poems are traumatic experiences, there's still a sort of innocence to them and a sort of joyfulness to it that's underneath the trauma, that to me, the way that those two emotions sort of work against each other was really, it was really grabbed me, really, really made it a special experience for me. Because I don't think that people, there's something about that contrast that can be difficult to get your arms around. And I know as a creative person, it's something that in my own work I sometimes try and engage with, but it can be difficult to really meld both of those, to get and to have that come across to other people.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I'm glad you noticed that about the earlier poems in the book. I really wanted the poems to feel, I had this early idea in an early draft of the manuscript where I was like, why don't I write all these poems from the perspective of someone who is actually the age of the speaker? Mm-hmm. That would have gone a little haywire, I think, had I really committed to that. But I did try to make the early poems feel youthful, right? Or feel hopeful, or feel like they're being written by someone who was once young and didn't have an understanding of death and all of its far-reaching implications, or didn't have an understanding of generational trauma. And so I really wanted to make those early poems childlike in a way without fully committing to not allowing myself the full range of language that I love. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to make those poems in the second section, poems that were a little bit carefree and not in a good way, you know what I mean? A little bit as I was in my late teens and early 20s, running a little bit reckless and unapologetic. There's a very long poem in the second section about toilet papering a house. And I remember talking to one of the people who edited the book about it. And they were like, well, this poem has no conclusion. There's no, you don't learn anything from this. And I was like, yeah, because I was an angry teenager in the suburbs, and I toilet papered a house and I didn't learn anything. There was no grander message for that. It was an outlet for this anger that I felt being the only black kid at a mostly, one of the few black kids at a mostly white college. And I wanted to express that in a poem. I wanted I wanted that to live. I wanted the work to live as honestly as I could make it live, in parallel with my experience.
Yeah. It seems like kind of a strange comment to me that, this was from an editor?
Well, it was like a friend. Yeah, like a friend, not an actual button poetry editor. I had a lot of my friends look at the manuscript, and I think, and this friend and a poet, I think, who was great, and I think that I don't think all poems need to have moral conclusions, and I don't know if that person does either. But I think for this poem, that poem was long and sprawling and doing a lot of things. I can see why someone may finish that poem and think, well, what did the speaker learn? What did the speaker take from this? Because otherwise it just feels like this poem is, in praise of recklessness. And I think that is what the poem is, right? I think that I am unashamed to write a poem in praise of recklessness, Yeah. And I am unashamed to write in praise of forgiveness for that recklessness later, which I think is a lot of the later poems in the book.
It's interesting. To me, one of the things that I really connected with in the story was not in the story, but in the sort of narrative of these poems, that there's a certain, especially in that second section, but really it seems like it kind of throughout. There's this feeling of separation between the speaker of the poems and many of the people around the speaker of the poem. There's I guess this sort of gets to one of the things you mentioned a bit ago, that experiences aren't universal, but I think a lot of times there's an assumption that experiences are universal, that we all have the same experiences, and there's this recognition, this sort of growing recognition throughout that it grows throughout the book, that's not the case, that's not true, and leaves you feeling this sense of isolation. And that was something that I really strongly related to, reading that. Growing up, I don't know exactly what your life was like, but for me, oftentimes I was one of the only Asian people in any place that I was, and so there was something that the experience isn't the same, but some nugget that you can grab onto,
Yeah, I think I was interested in that shift, right? That shift of going from a place where I was one of, many black people to a shift where I was one of few black people. I grew up in a largely black neighborhood. I was around mostly black people at all times. In close proximity to white people. I mean, Columbus is so, the suburbs kind of spill on top of the quote unquote urban areas, which is why, the gentrification of the city is so easy. The city sees it as so easy. It's so convenient for the structure of it, because all it's saying is we're just going to expand this suburb a little bit more. It's already on top of this, this quote unquote urban area. And so that proximity was interesting for me. I really wanted to get to the heart of that suffocating feeling of being a black person surrounded by both black people and suburbs where black people were frowned upon.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think there's something really powerful about art in general, and I mean, I was going to say maybe poetry in particular, but I'm not sure if that's necessarily the case. I think a lot of art can function this way, but that the way that it can give you insight, like the real power of it is that our experiences are not all the same. We don't all have this universal experience, and through art, you can get a view into somebody else's experience in a really personal, close kind of way that you can't really experience in other ways.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. It's something that that I certainly value. I aim for in my own work, but I value very deeply when someone else's work can do that for me. So thanks. So another thing that I thought was really really interesting about the book was that like most of it is written from what I assume is your perspective, but like here and there you have these repeating voices that come back throughout the book, and one of which is Tony the barber, and the other,
barber,
yeah. And the other is the ghost of the author's mother,
right?
And I thought that was a really interesting sort of device to have that sort of sprinkled through. It's almost like kind of like having a Greek chorus at times, you know. But I don't know, how did that end up happening?
The barber thing kind of started as a joke, right? I was in the barbershop back in Columbus shortly before I moved. I moved out of Columbus, in 2014. And I was in the barbershop, and my barber was just really had his foot on the gas on the rant. You know what I mean? Just like really. And I don't even remember what it was about. It was about sports, I'm sure. I'm sure it was about like the NBA and how it's like not like it was in the old days. And he was going on this massive rant. And I was like, gosh, this guy is a poet. He's a poet. I think the brilliance with which he speaks and can condense a lot of thoughts into a short amount of time is something that I think you see in black barbershops, right? I think black barbers are griots, right? They're storytellers, and they're geniuses, and they can do all of this stuff with language in a short amount of time, and they do it in such a compelling fashion. And so this barber who I had gone to often, my brothers used to cut my hair when I was very young, but I hit a point where I would go to this barber consistently. And his shop was closing down. His shop was a victim of the city's gentrification. And a big part of this project, The Crown Ain't Worth Much, was about archiving that which would soon be gone. And I thought, what a vital part of my life to archive. And so I started kind of reflecting on things he said. I mean, all of, obviously, those 4 poems in The Voice of My Barber in the book are not all verbatim, but there are things in all of those poems that are things he's actually said in real life. You know what I mean? And I really wanted to give this arc. And honestly, the 4th one, the last one, is mostly verbatim. That last one is like almost 100% the last conversation we had when I was getting a cut in a shop the day before it closed. And I really wanted to have a place for him in the book. I really wanted to have a place for, there are a lot of victims of gentrification, but I think people zoom out on it so much and lose the human element of it. And once the thing that I keep saying is like, if you cannot show people where you come from, they lose a type of empathy for who you are. And that echoes down through how they treat you for forever. And I really wanted Tony to have a place in this book as someone who is so proud to be from where I'm from, and as someone who fought for years to stay where he was in his barbershop and just couldn't fight anymore. And I think, people laugh at those poems, and that's great. And I think that there are funny elements of them. But I think that is if we're talking about sadness, I think that is the most heartbreaking work in the book, I always tell people to read that. People are like, well, I think it's funny because they pop up here and there. And I always tell people, read them together. Read all 4 of them together. because I think if they're read that way, and I consider just putting them back to back to back to back in the book, but I really wanted them to weave into the overarching narrative. But I mean, I think if they're read that way, it's a really heartbreaking story of someone watching a world change around them that they know they're soon going to lose access to. Yeah,
definitely. I mean, I guess I can see why people would find them to be funny, because like there's I mean, you can just sort of imagine the intensity of somebody sort of talking like in one long run-on sentence, and I guess there's a humor to that. But like you say, the what he's talking about, even with these little sort of asides that are not necessarily about just that, like, and those are the funny parts, often the asides, right? But that, like,
right,
the story that he's telling, you're right, is very. It's a tragedy. I guess I kind of wonder, thinking about that, that I think there's an interesting conversation that I've had with a few other people about like who you're writing for, or who you're making art for.
Right.
And
yeah.
Because like these poems and the stories that you're relating in these poems are very personal, and like you can't read these poems without it being really clear that like this is something that you're intimately familiar with, and it does, like, if you're sensitive to it and open to it, like, it does provide a window into that experience, but you're not really holding anybody's hand either, right? It's not like you're really explaining things to people either, right?
Right. Yeah. I think, and I don't want to knock. I had a conversation recently with some black poets about like how you write about the hood, because I'm writing about the hood, but you do it facing the hood, right? Like, I did not want to do this thing where I'm explaining these references, and because then my stance on audience is what it has always been, and that is the people who know will know, and everyone else who wants to come along for the ride will find out, and that is the safest and smartest way that I've always approached audience. I've never wanted to write a bunch of poems where I had to explain, these signifiers of black culture to people who don't have a proximity to it, or use a proximity to it as some kind of access or entry point that they end up doing terrible stuff with, and so, yeah, I mean, there are poems, even new poems I'm writing, I feel like I'm even further away from that. I have a poem about the opening scene in Belly, which is a 1998 film. It's like a very, like underground black history, and like I read that poem and I don't ever feel like I have to explain everything, what it is to people, right? Because I know that my people will understand, and everyone else will hopefully be compelled by the work and be driven enough to find out, because I think that is where, if we're talking about fostering empathy, I think the work of finding out that which you don't know is where that begins, right? And so I got it in my head that if I have to explain every movement of this work, every movement of the culture existing in this work, I am cutting off someone else's opportunity to find out for themselves and find out how to best honor that culture and respect the people in it.
Yeah.
I'm not saying that I'm like driving everyone to Wikipedia and educational, you know what I mean? But I think that it is, that avenue is a better avenue than me sitting in my work and explaining every single movement of the hood. If I'm being frank, like if I'm writing about my neighborhood where I grew up, I am writing facing those people, and I'm writing facing those people who have lived there, who have died there, who are still there. And in facing those people, I'm also facing other people in other neighborhoods like mine. I'm also facing people, like I think about someone like Nate Marshall, another poet who wrote the book Wild Hundreds, and it's about the South Side of Chicago. And I think about the parallels in our books. Our books have the same cover artist too. Our books are very much, I think, like cousins.
It's a beautiful cover, by the way.
Shout out Max Sansing from Chicago. But I think about parallels in our books, and I think about how like we are writing to similar hoods. we're right, you know what I mean? We're both facing them, and also inviting other people to come in and learn, and find out how to best honor and show empathy to these cultures.
Mm-hmm. It's a thing where I feel like a lot of times I will read, critics or even not actual critics, but just readers with opinions who will say things about, some piece of art that makes references without explaining them, like this is leaving me out kind of thing, right? And so a lot of times you'll even see people, leave like little finger waggy, I don't know, Amazon reviews where they're like, I wish I could have been brought along, but this person obviously doesn't care about bringing me along, or I felt left out. But it just like really seems to be missing the point, because especially because Western art and especially American poetry has such a history of being very centered on talking about and by and to white people, that it's like having the experience of some reader who's not that typical straight white person be able to come into a poem and see themselves reflected in a way that they might not have been able to a few decades ago. I mean, that's such an important and valuable thing. And I feel like for me, like it's something that I didn't really start finding art that spoke to me on a personal level until like maybe last year. I was like the first time I read a novel that really captured certain aspects of the Asian American experience for me was like last year. Before that I had never had that. And it was something I didn't really even realize that I was missing until I had it,
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and I don't think that anything is leaving people out. I think it's really calling them in, actually. I think it's challenging them, right? I want to challenge readers. And I want to challenge all my readers, but I want to challenge readers who don't have a shared experience that I do, right? And I don't think, I don't think anything I write is leaving out those people. I think it is saying this is an opportunity for you to get, again, we're talking about windows, right? An opportunity for you to get a window into a world that is not like your world, and really have it open up more windows for you to understand a world. I would not be anywhere without the work, reading, or from an early age, the work of Black women, reading the work of queer folks, reading the work of people who don't live in the world the way that I do, right? Mm-hmm. And so the challenge isn't, why isn't this including me? The challenge is, can you not feel included and still feel comfortable, right?
Yeah.
Feel comfortable with your lack of your whatever you think your lack of inclusion is,
or even just finding value without feeling comfortable.
Yeah, that's exactly it, right? Like, can you find value in this work that you imagine isn't speaking to you? But I think like even the work that people don't think is speaking to them is speaking to them. It might not it's just not saying what they wanted to say,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's not the easy answer.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that runs through this poem, and actually it's run through this conversation a little bit too, I've noticed that music is a really consistent theme and metaphor throughout the book. And I know you write for MTV.com.
I do write for MTV.
Yeah. And it was something that when I was thinking about, I can't remember if I started reading this book first or your MTV essays first, but there was just something like, taking them both together, that there's a way that music works as this metaphor for so many other things. And also provides this real point of connection, like everybody, like there, even just in like the last poem in the book, there's a reference to Nirvana, and it's such a moment in time. Like Nirvana represents such a specific cultural moment, that like it really, I don't know, thinking about your poems, how music operates in them, and how for so many of us, the music has such this strong tie to memory and how it articulates, but also provides a lens for how we experience our lives. It was really, I enjoyed it.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think I was a music writer first, and then a poet second, and so much of my brain is wired into song, both song and story, right? I kind of, I'm a big Springsteen nerd, you know, like I'm really into Springsteen, which is, I think, funny probably for someone of my age and demographic in general. But from an early age, I was kind of wired into this idea of what story can we extract from music? How can I make music greater than music? Because I grew up in a house where music was greater than music. You know, music meant something. Music was, and then once I was a teenager, I was on these scenes, these punk and emo scenes where music was like actually life-saving. And so I approach all of my work refusing to believe that music is just music, as corny as that sounds, right? But, because sometimes, quite frankly, music is just music, but I think the real work is finding, for me, what I can pull out of it, what I can extract out of it, what can I use, what tools can I use to pull out something else.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting that you'd bring up Springsteen, especially because a lot of people have talked about how Springsteen, in the way that he writes, is always being very specific to his like very particular New Jersey experience, you know?
Oh yeah.
And that's something that's also true of your poetry, how it's very specific. But you know, that's one of those things where, I don't know, specificity, the more I try to do anything as an artist, the more I realize, you know, like when you're young and or at least for me, when I was younger and trying to make art that I wanted to say a certain thing, like I would feel like I had to get away from, like get outside of myself more. And then the older I get, then the more I sort of feel like, no, really what I need to do is just sound more like me and have that specificity. And that's where the power ends up coming from.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I think and I think, you know, I mean, Springsteen's kind of away from it now, but I think on those like, and I won't talk about Springsteen a lot because I talk about Springsteen forever, but on those like, you know, maybe up until like The River, there was so much like inside Jersey stuff, right? Mm-hmm. There was so much like, I think like down to a finer point, I think the first two records were so inside Asbury, and he did not let that stop him, right? He was like, these are the stories I have accumulated from my hometown, and why can't these stories resonate with someone else? Mm-hmm. And I think that's the approach I took. You know, my book was born not out of Springsteen. I was listening to Good Kid, Mad City, the Kendrick Lamar record, which has a similar feel, right? It's about this like imagined childhood coming of age in Compton, California. And I remember thinking, like, why can't something like this exist for Columbus, Ohio, where I'm from? Why can't something like this exist for the Midwest? And I leaned into that really heavy. And I thought about Springsteen a lot, who was like writing these songs about Asbury Park as if it was the entire world. And so I thought, well, why can't I write poems about Columbus, Ohio, as if it's the entire world, as if it's everywhere? Because, you know, in my small little corner, you know, Columbus, Ohio is everywhere. And so I have no choice but to write from that perspective and hope that people will join me. Yeah. And it's especially true, you know, when you're young, you really don't know anything else. And, you know, like several of the poems, the early poems in this book are written from that young perspective. I don't know. I think it works really great. And I also really enjoy your music writing. One of the recent ones that came out towards the end of last year where you're writing about Chance the Rapper. Yeah. Like that, I mean, that made my week better, reading that. And the funny thing is that, like, I guess I had listened to some of his music before, but not like, I don't know, I'm not really very
cool, I guess, when it comes to
No,
music sometimes.
I'm sure you're entirely cool. What are you listening to right now?
Well, now I'm listening to Coloring Book, largely because of your essay. But there's something. I had heard his music before, just like I'd heard the Donnie Trumpet album before, but I don't know. Right now, I'm mostly listening to Coloring Book, and I've been listening to the Hamilton soundtrack on repeat for like a year now. But
both of those things are very cool. Both of those things are extremely cool.
Well, my point in mentioning it is just that, like, there's the way that you were writing about that album. Like, again, it was a similar thing where, like, there's no point in that essay where you're explaining, like, who Chance the Rapper is, right? It's taken as for granted that the person who's reading this is going to, like, know who he is. And then so much of that essay, there's like a personal aspect, but there's also an analytical aspect. And this is true about a lot of the music writing that you do, where there is this sort of personal point of connection with the music. I was thinking also about, like, you wrote a piece about Marvin Gaye last year that I really, really enjoyed. But where you can really dive into the music in a way that sort of it articulates the music without explaining it. Does that make sense? I don't know if I'm saying this right.
I think that's also, yeah. I mean, I try to approach the music writing in the same way I approach the poems when it comes to not explaining. I mean, of course, some things, I think I tend to write looking back, if I'm writing about a piece of music that's older, I kind of maybe have to a little bit, but I never want to. I think the best music writing is that which kind of sets a person down in the middle of what I love about a song or an artist or an album, mm-hmm. and lets them. I am not trying to, in my work, I'm not trying to convince anyone to love any songs that I love. I am trying to say, here's why I have a personal connection with this. Here's what this did for me. Mm-hmm. And it might do that for you too. You know what I mean? I think that more casual way of an approach to criticism has served me well, because I think it invites people in and doesn't push them too hard in any direction to love a song or not love a song. And that's what got me to love a lot of the music I love, is people not really being pushy and just saying, like, here's the thing I like and you might like it too. Yeah.
Well, and there's an authenticity to it too, that, like, rather than being, like, when you're faced with something that's a like explicitly a review, I don't know if we're naming names here or whatever, but like something that you might read on Pitchfork or something. A lot of the stuff has this real sort of, quality to it that of judgment, rather than, like, there's something that about the way that you write about music, and that other writers that I enjoy writing about music, where there's an authenticity and an honesty to it, where it's showing, as you say, like, what is your connection with the music, rather than, like, this is why you should or shouldn't, like, what you should think about the music. And it provides a lot. It's a much more powerful experience reading that kind of music writing for me.
Yeah, people don't like being told what to think, it turns out. And so I think, like, for me, like, I did not like being told what to think when I was, a younger music fan. And so for me, I am more interested in, like, having the other conversation, which is, let me show you every great music conversation to me that I'm trying to do when I'm writing is essentially me saying, let me show you my record collection. Mm-hmm. I'm inviting a person into my house and saying, let me show you these records I like. And I'm not saying, like, here's a record you're going to like. Here's a record you have to like. Here's a song you're going to like. It's just like, let me tell you the story behind this album I got.
Yeah. Well, I really appreciate it. So
that's great. I appreciate you appreciating it.
So we should probably move into the second segment soon, but I was wondering if you didn't mind if you might read something for us?
Sure. Yeah, I'll read like a short poem. So I'm doing this project. Sorry, I'm not going to read a poem out of the book, if that's cool.
Yeah.
Unless you really want a poem out of the book, which I can also do.
It's up to you.
All right, this is a poem. I'm doing this project where I'm writing a poem for every song on the Jay-Z Kanye West album Watch the Throne, which came out like almost 6 years ago. And the challenge in this is that I have to incorporate at least 3 lines of language from the original lyrics into the poem. And all of the poems are named after the songs they're written after. So I'm going to read a poem called No Church in the Wild.
Okay.
Centuries removed from the cruel interior of the Colosseum, a boy rips the sleeve from his homeboy's shirt and washes it in the gasoline before pushing it into a tunnel of glass and lighting a match. No sins as long as there's permission, as long as the morning arrives with a fresh casket. This is what becomes of us. Death as entertainment long before there was a language for all the blood or the color it made on anything other than dry sand, while a king cheered. I am looking at the pictures of animals that eat their own and thinking I must belong to a row of teeth sharpened by my own living. I am saying last night was mad real. Last night was mad. Last night there was a tank next to a church in the hood, and I am still here in a country that prays in the name of both with the same tongue. It all sounds like asking God to pull at the edges of heaven's wide, wide skirt. It all sounds like asking God to make more room, more room, more room.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah.
All right. Okay, so we'll take a short break. We'll come right back to the second segment. For the second segment, I always ask the guests to bring a topic of their own, and it can be anything they want, whatever they've been thinking about, something important to them. So what would you like to talk about today?
I want to talk about the Columbus Blue Jackets.
All right.
They're Columbus, Ohio's hockey team. And this is like a very special topic to me at this point, at this weird point in my life.
So what is it about the Blue Jackets that really does it for you?
So a hilarious thing is that, so Columbus is a, have you ever talked to anyone else from Columbus on here?
I think so. Yeah, actually, I'm pretty sure Hannah Stevenson is from Columbus.
Hannah, you talked to Hannah?
Yeah.
Oh, Hannah is so great.
Yeah, she's really great.
I adore Hannah, a great deal. So like, I'm sure Hannah didn't talk about the Blue Jackets, although maybe she did. I think her husband is somehow involved with them. But anyway, Columbus is like a real sports heavy town, right? Because the Ohio State Buckeyes are there, and they're kind of like the pro sports team, right? They're like a college team, but people treat the Ohio State football team like it's a pro team. And then the Columbus Crew, or I'm sorry, I have to call them by their proper name now, Columbus Crew SC. They changed their name a couple years ago and like rebranded, and they're very, very sensitive about using their right name. So Columbus Crew SC came to the city in the 90s and had like some pretty, it was like a cool vibe because they were like the first soccer specific stadium in America, and it was like massively cool, and they had some early success, and they were just in the MLS Cup again last year, or 2 years ago. And the Crew just had this huge following. I fell in love with the Crew early on because I was a soccer kid, and it just followed them their entire time in Columbus, even after I moved. The Blue Jackets, however, are a different kind of weird thing. So the Columbus Blue Jackets came along to Columbus in the early 2000s. I think their like first season might have been the year 2000. And they were kind of like this clumsy NHL expansion team. Like their mascot was this weird, like hornet named Stinger, and that's still their mascot. He has this like really scary face, but is also just really creepy. And for a while, they had this secondary mascot. I don't know if this is inappropriate for the podcast, but they had this secondary mascot that was like really phallic. It was supposed to be a cannon with like 2 wheels as feet, but they went horribly wrong. And so they had this like phallic cannon as a mascot for like a year before the city was like, we can't have, like the penis cannon has to go. And all the while they're like also just like losing a bunch. They're never good. They lost they're just like one of the worst teams in the league, and they have this like terrible mascot situation, and people in Columbus have started to hate them because like Nationwide Arena costs a ton of where they play costs a ton of money, and like not only did the city build Nationwide Arena, but they built an entire like there's a part of downtown Columbus called the Arena District. So the city did not only build Nationwide Arena, but they built an entire district of things around it. You know what I mean? So like Nationwide Arena was like a time suck and a money suck, and it was just like this huge thing that drained. And so like I'm like a lot of people in Columbus who like when the Blue Jackets first came to Columbus, I was hyped, I was going to games, I was into it. And then as around the third season, I think a lot of attention waned, and they were just bad. And there were brief things in between there. They were in, they made it to the playoffs in 2013, 2014. And there was like a short, brief burst of excitement. They lost in the first round, but it was just like really cool to see them in the playoffs. It was just like phenomenal. And so what happened was this year was supposed to be a rebuilding year for the Blue Jackets, and they're like randomly good. And they're randomly good for a lot of reasons, but mostly, so they're at the top of the league right now, right? They're the number one, they're like the top of the NHL after like being really trash last year, after like being like killed by injuries and just being like not good. And they went on this like massive winning streak. Last year they finished 8th in their like division, right? Bottom. And they just, like they didn't lose a game in December at all. And so it was this weird rallying point for the city, and for like a lot of long suffering fans. There's that thing that happens in sports, I think, where you get these long suffering fans, and then something impossible happens, right? Mm-hmm. And it really just draws everyone back in. And so like I became this like randomly very big hockey fan. And now I have like a Blue Jackets jersey and a Blue Jackets, like I have the whole thing. And I like stream because I live in Connecticut now. So I've got to like stream all the Blue Jackets games on NHL TV. And I like know all these random hockey stats now, so the Blue Jackets are, the thing that really means the most to me right now as a former Columbus resident. I'm learning that like my favorite sport is rooting for Columbus teams to do well. And so, my dream is that the Blue Jackets win the Stanley Cup, the Crew SC wins the MLS Cup, and the Columbus Clippers win their trophy. The Columbus Clippers are sorry that I'm rambling about Columbus sports to people who are listening to this. But the Columbus Clippers are actually the most successful team in Columbus. Columbus Clippers are the minor league baseball team in Columbus, and they play at Huntington Park, which is like nicer than some MLB stadiums. Huntington Park is like the mecca of minor league baseball. And they have like, 10 league titles, and they have like a billion division titles. They win the Governor's Cup is the name of the cup. They win it. They either win it or are in contention for it almost every year. And so I really just want the Blue Jackets to rise to the occasion of the Clippers and the Crew for always kind of being in the mix. And I once joked that if all three of the Columbus teams won titles in the same sports calendar year, I would move home. And I think I'm actually in danger of having to fulfill that this year. I don't know. At least I'm hoping. I'm always hoping for the Crew to not disappoint me.
Yeah. It's funny, I had a really hard time getting into sports when I was younger, and part of that was just that where I grew up, it was sort of like a little rural town, didn't have any sports teams. Like we had high school sports, but that was it. And it wasn't even a thing. But like, as I got older and moved to a city that actually had a sports team, like there's something about local sports that really, like, it's like this ability, it gives you the ability to connect with something bigger than yourself and feel like you're part of something. And I think there's something like the way that informs regional identity that is like, it's really, really valuable.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And obviously, as I get older, it's harder for me to enter some sports. This was a year I kind of like stopped watching football. And which was hard because I'm from a football, a place, it's part of the country that is really intense about football. Mm-hmm. And I was for a long time. And I realized there are the pitfalls of the culture around sports. I realize that more as I age, but I am still really drawn to sports in a way, and I'm still really drawn to, like you said, those regional aspects of it, especially in Columbus, where, or Ohio. I think in Ohio in general, right? This perpetual underdog state, that has used sports to really unite and propel itself to some incredible things, you know what I mean? And so I think there is no better place to be a sports fan than Ohio. And I think particularly, my Cleveland friends would argue Cleveland, especially with the recent success of those sports stories up in Cleveland. Mm-hmm. So I guess realistically, there's no better place in Ohio to be a sports fan than Cleveland. If I'm just I'll secede that point. But I think that there's a lot of magic in Columbus as well. And we're seeing it. I mean, this Blue Jackets surge has been so huge for the city. I was back about a week and a half ago, 2 weeks, and I went to a game. And to be at a Blue Jackets game now in 2017 versus what it was like to be at a Blue Jackets game in 2008. You know what I mean? It's just such a different and beautiful experience.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's really nothing like it when the team, your home team, is the one that's doing well, giving you that. It's like sometimes you can get in a place where especially if you're sort of a long suffering fandom and there might not necessarily be a lot to hang on to in certain other aspects of a region. Not to say that I don't know if that sounds kind of shitty, but
no, it doesn't.
But everybody talks about how the Midwest and Ohio is got a lot of sort of structural problems, and having something that you can hang on to that is optimistic and that gives you something to hope for, it spills out into all manner of other aspects of your life.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, it inspires, right? It inspires and kind of makes living and loving a place a little bit easier. And I think that is maybe the best thing, right?
Yeah. So we're at about an hour now, and I don't want to keep you too long. The last thing I ask everyone before we go is if there's one piece of art or literature that has mattered to you recently.
Aziza Barnes. Aziza Barnes is a poet. They are a poet from Los Angeles, and I think they are now in Mississippi. I'm actually holding their book as I speak. It's called I Be But I Ain't. And what I love, full disclosure, Aziza is one of the homies, I love Aziza.
Yeah.
And what I love about Aziza's writing is that it is, for me, very, it gives me the same permission that Zora Neale Hurston's writing gave me, when I was younger, and I wanted to see someone who was writing like I spoke. And Zora Neale Hurston provided that. Zora Neale Hurston provided a firm permission to allow me to write in the way that I was speaking. And Aziza's work does that for me. Aziza using language in their poems that is like the language I use with the homies when I'm not writing, when no one is listening. And I think that is a type of visibility that really empowers, right?
Yeah.
A visibility that really propels me to get to the work and not feel ashamed of writing words in my poems that is language that only me and my friends might understand. So yeah. Aziza Barnes always, Aziza Barnes forever.
Nice. Yeah, Aziza is 1/3 of the poetry gods.
Yes.
And I just, the episode that's going to come right before this one, that will have aired 2 weeks before this comes out, I got to talk to Jose Olivares.
Oh, no way. Are you serious? Did he lie to you about the Chicago Bulls? Because that's what he does.
That's actually, their podcast is actually how I first heard about you. And I told this to Jose, and I tell him this actually basically all the time. That podcast is like my favorite podcast, even including this one.
It's the best. It's my favorite. I love it so much.
Yeah, and Aziza's poetry, like you said, oh man, the specificity of voice in their work is amazing. And also, like I remember once, I'm not sure if it was more than once, but Aziza read a poem on that show once, and there's one thing to read it, but like hearing Aziza read the poem aloud just adds a whole other thing.
It's a whole other experience.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Well, great. So I'll put a link to that in the show notes, definitely. And I'm really glad that you're willing to take some time and talk to me. I really appreciate it. I had a good time.
No, this was great. Thank you for letting me talk about Columbus sports. And I mean, obviously other stuff too, but thanks for letting me ramble about Columbus sports for a while.
Yeah, anytime. Okay, so as I mentioned at the top of the show, Hanif's book of essays, They Can't Kill Us Until They Kill Us, will be available from $2 Radio in November of this year, 2017. And his full-length book of poems, The Crown Ain't Worth Much, is available now from Button Poetry, and there are links for both of those in the show notes. Coming up, Hanif will be making a whole lot of appearances around the country. On March 2nd, he will be at Burl's Brooklyn Poetry Shop in Brooklyn, reading with Ocean Vuong. On March 3rd, he'll be reading at UConn in Storrs, Connecticut. On March 4th, he will be in Austin, Texas at the Paramount Theater. And on March 9th, he will be at Town Hall in Seattle. You can find details for all of those dates and more at his website, Abdurraqib.com, and there is a link in the show notes for that. And that is our show. If you have any questions about today's episode or really about anything, you can email me at podcast@keepthechannelopen.com. You can follow me and the show on Twitter at ChannelOpenPod or on Facebook at facebook.com/keepthechanneleopen. If you like this episode, please do leave a review on iTunes. That is an easy and free way to help out the show, and there's a link in the show notes for that. If you want to go a little further in supporting the show, you can make a monthly pledge to our Patreon campaign, which is at patreon.com/sakeriver. That is sake like the drink and river like a river. And if you want to stay up to date and never miss an episode, you can subscribe to the podcast via iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, or your favorite podcast app. Our theme music is by Poddington Bear. You can find more of his music available for licensing at soundofpicture.com. Next time, our guest will be San Diego photographer Paul Tourné, so be sure to come back for that. And until then, remember, keep the channel open.